So I was thinking to myself recently, how much of these issues that men talk about when it applies to dating and marriage, certainly, but also when it applies to friendship, when it applies to housing costs, and a plethora of other issues, perhaps. You hear a lot of talk about the West. And I was thinking how much of these things perhaps apply on a global scale, or at the very least, other parts of the world. Because you hear a lot of men who are going overseas, whether it's for work, whether it's for marriage. And what I found was very interesting, but also very telling of what could be soon to come, if it hasn't already. And that is in South Korea, they have the lowest fertility rate of anywhere on the globe. Also, at any point in modern history since this sort of metric was collected, and it is, when I had checked, zero point 0.7 and between zero point 0.7 and zero point 0.8 births per woman. Now, what I found very interesting about that were that the primary drivers of why that is the case, which in my opinion you could really say lower rate of marriage as well. I mean, I would imagine those things go hand in hand. But some of the main drivers were things like high housing costs, like longer work hours, competitive pressure, but also a big influx in young women who see motherhood as in a downgrade or a burden, much like a lot of what you see here from the millennial and Gen Z generations. And I will say this, when you see men rejecting, at the very least, conventional forms of marriage is because of the risks involved, like divorce. It's not because they're rejecting the role of fatherhood. And I remember when I was in grade school, there was a big push to reject this idea of being a mother, like it is in some way a downgrade. And we certainly have seen the remnants of that. I mean, you just look at people who are roughly my age, older, and even younger perhaps, and the millennial generation who, and I could even say, or I would say rather, in many ways they're worse than the Gen Z kind of dating scene, because now we're seeing what happens with that mindset if you get to a point where you're 35, 40 years old. But nonetheless, when it comes to this sort of topic, I remember a time where there wasn't so much competitive pressure, but also obsession on the status, certainly with friendships, right? You could have someone who is unemployed, someone who is making a six-figure salary, someone who's married, someone who's single, someone who's making YouTube videos at 1 a.m. for whatever reason. And they could all be in the same friend circle. No one was judging one another. No one was trying to one up, or at least for the most part. There wasn't this big sort of competitive pressure and obsession on the status. Now, I had a conversation with someone earlier today who he himself has family from South Korea. We talked for a couple hours over the phone, and he was telling me that what you see over there is much like what you see here. The social media obsession is even more pronounced there, rather. And he was saying how women are rejecting, or really just, there's this form of hypergamy, but also a lack of loyalty and commitment. A lot of these weird open relationships. He was saying the stuff you see on social media was essentially the same stuff that you see here in terms of the really things that shouldn't be at all influences. So in many ways it makes sense. But the conclusion that we both had come to was that certainly a loss in value of family, but also a more of a highlighted, or rather dominance of technology and social media that a society has, the more problems like that arise. And of course, when I was younger, you had technology, but I would say it wasn't dominant, right? And I remember as a kid poking holes in erasers for fun. Now, even with that, you had things like video games, you had the phones. Of course, you didn't have smartphones, but I remember even the PlayStation 2, the very loud startup sound of it. And quick kind of pro tip here, but even in the middle of the night back in 01, 02, 03, if you didn't want your parents knowing, you would have the TV off, turn the console on, and then wait a few seconds and turn the TV on. So we always had technology, but it wasn't as forefront of a thing that it is now. With the dating apps, with the social media, it's nothing but hypergamy. The competitive pressure times 10 now with that stuff. And I will say this as well, coming from a background that I guess I would say is, you could consider more traditional. My family from Eastern Europe and that sort of area. I myself have definitely seen the pressure from family of expectations. I'm not saying for myself, but I heard of it and seen it in general. You go to college, you get a job, you work, you have a family, you retire, and really that is the expectation. And it almost becomes a sort of narrow, dogmatic kind of view where it can come to the point where someone, depending if they're very old school or whatnot, will see that and think that is the only route to success. Go to college, get a career, retire. And someone could, for example, be making very good money if they're an entrepreneur or with a startup or starting their own business. And someone could be making maybe $40,000 a year, and depending on, what job they end up getting, you might have a family member who might think, oh, well, they went to college and they're working a job. They would applaud them, but not the guy who is an entrepreneur or doing some form of a startup. They think, well, that's a side hustle, that's not sustainable. Now, point being, I've definitely seen the competitive pressure with the very narrow, almost dogmatic ways of thinking. But I also know of the competitive pressure that has been really running rampant in dating, and why so many men are refusing to take part. Why you see a lower number of people getting married or having kids. And it just seems like we are going the exact same direction. And even when it comes to housing costs, because it's been a while since I've talked about that, if you guys have, depending on how long you've been watching my video. So I want to make a portion of this video dedicated to that, because I hear this brought up a lot as to why men aren't dating. Now, of course, I certainly think it can play a factor. But if you look at even the data on that, when I had looked it up recently, so there's a higher rate of home ownership among single women. And I would imagine is because a lot of those, and from the research I had done, a lot of those are widows, a lot of whom are also divorced, where single women are far more likely to be the head of a single parent household for reasons. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard of someone or known someone perhaps even that was divorced, that got the short end of the stick on that end of the deal, and custody battles and all those kind of things. So with that, a lot more women are likely, they're far more likely to be the head of single parent households. But more so, I think that men and women are dealing with the same sort of financial issues regardless of that, right? And I'm someone who, growing up, my parents bought their house back in the very late 90s. And even back then, this would have been considered expensive, but they paid $180,000 for it. Now, and keep in mind, it's not I would say objectively, it's not a huge house or anything. It's about 1,500 square feet. There's some 2 or 3 bedroom apartments that are that size. And just because of the area and the increase in costs in the housing prices, that house is now worth, I think, something like $1.2 million last time I checked. And I don't know who would spend that kind of money on a house like that. I'll be upfront in saying that too. But I certainly think it plays a factor. I certainly think that in terms of peace of mind, it plays a factor, and I'll have to rather having to worry about that kind of stuff. And I would imagine that it has definitely given men the incentive to walk away. I saw a great comment talking about how really just finding a piece of land and finding peace, or going overseas to somewhere where it's more affordable, and I think that can apply there. But when it comes to this example in particular I saw, where they mention one of the main drivers being the housing costs. It certainly seems like the same things sort of apply that are applying here. But I will say this too. The behavior from the younger generation, from modern women in other parts of the world, also seem to be primary drivers. Because I would say this too. When it comes to these labels, like male loneliness epidemic, all these things we've heard, really all that is just men being fed up with the behavior. That's what it comes down to when it comes to men walking away from dating and marriage. And if they don't see a prospect for loyalty, for a long-term relationship, they probably just think, what's the point? And ultimately that's going to lead to these things. But I think a lot of the time, people don't realize just how bad things are with all of the negative influences. Because when I had this conversation with a friend earlier, he was saying that there's almost this weird sort of double standard kind of open relationship where some of the men in that part of the world are so desperate for female attention that they're willing to overlook red flags and take disrespect and have no form of boundaries or anything like that, self-respect. And women will be in these weird open relationships and they'll just be the ones that have to be loyal and committed. And they'll be totally fine with that for whatever reason. Now, that is absolutely ridiculous. That is why it's important for men to be aware of these kind of things and have discernment. Because I'll put it this way, even when it comes to what I had mentioned, careers and stuff like that, there are people who perhaps do well career-wise. Now, of course, the job market, that whole thing in itself, I know people that are out of work, in particular people that were into software, where they're trying to apply for jobs as post-grads and they are competing with people who have had 2, 3, 4, 5 years of experience, which is ridiculous. But even with that, I would just say someone that might be much more book smart, I guess, and maybe more naive when it comes to dating and stuff, I would say avenue it the same way. The analytic kind of way of thinking that would apply to a math problem or a career, just venture it the same way. There's nothing wrong at all. That's just being logical and having common sense as far as I'm concerned, which is sadly something that I think doesn't seem as common. Now, I've been seeing a lot of this from, in particular, Gen Z, and more so older Gen Z who were born in the late 90s or very early 2000s. But this craving of a time, really nostalgia, but I don't even know if I'd call it that, but a time where things were just simpler, maybe peace through simplicity, if that's the right way to word it. And I remember even the first time that my dad had brought us, me and my little brother, a couple Nintendo DS. It was very exciting. And I would say to me, that's nostalgic, right? And something else I'll add in there, I find so interesting how you can boot up a 20-year-old piece of hardware and it still runs perfectly fine. So I guess dating and such wasn't the only thing that was better back then. But with that, I think a lot of it just comes down to the fact that so many people, so many men are just frustrated right now. Then yeah, of course they're going to walk away. Why would you want to have to deal with all the nonsense? I think it's a big reason why so many men are done with marriage, done with dating, done with a plethora of other things. Because they would rather have their peace and not have to deal with all of these distractions and pressure. The constant comparison, the constant really just pressure on your shoulders, like I mentioned, that seemingly comes from nowhere. So I think with that, a lot of men are just opting out. And I think that if I were to have to guess, from what I had been told in this conversation, if the same things are going on in other areas, yeah, of course you're going to see those men opt out too. You're going to see them want no part in it. So, as always, guys, I appreciate you for viewing the video and just kind of my thoughts on that whole discussion, which I think is a very interesting discussion because it seems pretty apparent that men are walking away on a global scale. That's what it seems like to me. I think it's a lot more than just the West, because really it's a behavior thing, and at least from what it seems like, the influences of social media and technology seem to be a global thing, as well as a plethora of other factors, which really is leading to men opting out, leading to them walking away. So, as always, guys, I appreciate you for viewing, and I will say this too. When people talk about really a search for peace and solitude, if you were going to do, right, because even I would imagine, or I shouldn't say imagine, I'm well aware that times were different. But even though people would still work and even work long hours, they would still have a form of peace and solitude, at least more so than we do now. I think the big difference is everything else around us. So again, guys, as always, thank you for viewing. Hope you guys have a good one.